When a veteran was mocked by seemingly successful businessmen, the passengers on the bus were outraged, but no one spoke up. It was the bus driver who stepped in to defend him. As a result, he lost his job, and it seemed like his life was falling into despair. However, the veteran was no ordinary man. His influence helped the bus driver turn his life around and gave him the opportunity to pursue his true calling, advocating for the rights of veterans. Calvin Brooks had been driving bus 17 through the streets of Jacksonville for nearly 15 years. Every morning, just before the city shook off its slumber, he would climb into the driver's seat, adjust the rearview mirror, and begin his route through the heart of a city that never quite made room for people like him, people who worked quietly, without fanfare, but kept everything running. He wasn't a man who talked much, but he saw everything. The tired factory workers rubbing sleep from their eyes. The single mothers trying to keep their kids entertained with nothing but a cracked phone screen. The young Marines heading to the base, boots still new, shoulders squared with purpose. And the veterans, men like his father who had given everything to their country, and now sat quietly in the back of his bus, trying to blend into a world that no longer seemed to need them. His father had been a proud man, a Marine who had come back from war with scars no one could see. Calvin had watched him struggle, watched the way he bristled at loud noises, how his hands sometimes shook when he thought no one was looking. But the hardest part had been the way people treated him like he was invisible. Calvin never forgot that. He had made a silent promise a long time ago that as long as he was behind the wheel, no veteran would feel forgotten on his bus. That was why the small American flag on his dashboard wasn't just decoration. It was a reminder. This morning, the rain had started early, drumming steadily against the windshield as he pulled up to his first stop. The usual crowd shuffled in quiet nods, murmured greetings. Then, at the next stop, a man boarded who caught Calvin's attention immediately. He was older, his frame still strong despite the years that had settled on his shoulders. His face was lined, his jaw set with the quiet discipline of a soldier. He wore a faded military jacket, its patches barely visible through years of wear, and a plain baseball cap pulled low over his brow. Calvin didn't ask any questions. He didn't need to. He recognized the way the man scanned the bus before choosing his seat, the way he moved with precision, every step calculated. The kind of awareness you didn't lose, even after decades away from the battlefield. The man dropped his fare into the box and gave Calvin a nod. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Calvin returned it just the same. The bus rolled forward, the steady hum of the engine a familiar comfort as the rain blurred the city outside. Calvin's hands rested on the wheel, his eyes flicking to the mirror now and then. The man sat near the back, staring out at the streets, lost in thought. Another stop. More passengers. Then another. The morning routine falling into place like it always did. Until the next stop. When the doors hissed open, a different kind of energy stepped onto the bus. 3 men in tailored suits, their shoes polished, their laughter sharp, cutting through the quiet like a knife. They carried the air of men who had never been told no, who had never had to wait for anything in their lives. Their conversation was loud, laced with the easy arrogance of people who believed the world belonged to them. Calvin didn't need to hear much to know their type. He had spent years watching men like the men who thought wealth was the same as worth, who measured people by the brands on their clothes and the numbers in their bank accounts. They moved down the aisle without looking at anyone, still talking, still laughing. Then, as one of them brushed past the older man's seat, he stopped. The shift in energy was immediate. The man in the suit glanced down at the older man, his smirk twisting into something colder. "Didn't know they let fossils ride in first class," he said, loud enough for the whole bus to hear. The older man didn't react. He just stared out the window, his jaw tight. But Calvin saw the way his hands curled slightly, the way his shoulders stiffened, not in fear, but in restraint. Another suit chuckled. "Maybe he got lost. VA's a few miles down the road, old man." The third one leaned in, shaking his head mockingly. "Nah, leave him be. He's probably still having flashbacks." Laughter. Sharp. Mean. Calvin's fingers tightened around the wheel. He had seen his father sit just like that, jaw locked, hands clenched, swallowing down words he had every right to say. The first man took it further. He reached out, knocked the older man's cap off his head. It hit the floor with a soft thud, rolling slightly, and for the first time, Calvin saw at the deep, jagged scar running across the man's scalp. The bus went silent. Even the other passengers, who had been doing their best to pretend they weren't listening, shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. No one moved. The man in the suit smirked, but something flickered in his eyes: hesitation. Calvin let the silence stretch, thick and heavy. He reached for the mic attached to his dashboard, pressing the button with deliberate slowness. "Either apologize to this man," he said, his voice even, controlled, "or get off my bus." The words hung in the air, sinking in. The smirk faltered. "Excuse me?" Calvin turned in his seat, locking eyes with him through the mirror. His voice didn't rise. He didn't need it to. "You heard me." The tension was a living thing now, pressing against the walls of the bus, filling every inch of space between them. The passengers watched, waiting. The man in the suit scoffed, shaking his head. "You can't do that. We paid." Calvin's gaze didn't waver, and he paid for his service with blood. His voice was calm, measured, but there was steel beneath it. "Your money doesn't buy you respect." For a moment, no one moved. Then, one of the suits muttered something under his breath, stuffing his hands in his pockets as he turned toward the door. The others hesitated, but eventually they followed. The bus doors hissed open. The rain outside had turned heavier, drumming against the pavement in steady sheets. The men stepped out into the storm. As soon as they were gone, someone exhaled sharply. A ripple of murmured approval spread through the bus, quiet but unmistakable. Calvin said nothing. He just turned back to the wheel, pressing the gas pedal gently. In the mirror, he saw the older man lean down, pick up his cap, and dust it off before settling it back on his head. Then, for the first time, he turned, just slightly, and met Calvin's gaze through the mirror. He gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Calvin returned it. No words were needed. The rest of the ride was quiet, the weight of the moment settling into the worn fabric of the bus seats. The murmurs of approval had faded, but the atmosphere was different now, charged, heavy with something unspoken. Calvin kept his hands steady on the wheel, his focus on the rain-streaked windshield, but he felt the shift behind him. Passengers sat a little straighter. Eyes flicked toward the back of the bus, where the older man remained still, his cap pulled low once more, the scar hidden beneath the brim. Calvin didn't say anything. He wasn't looking for gratitude. He hadn't done it for that. He had done it because it needed to be done. Because a man like that, a man who had already given more than most could imagine, deserved more than silence. The city blurred past, the wipers sweeping slow, rhythmic arcs across the glass. The bus hummed along its route, stopping and starting, letting people off, letting others on. At every stop, Calvin felt eyes on him, lingering just a little longer than usual. He ignored it. He had a job to do. When they reached the last stop, the end of the line, the older man finally moved. He pushed himself to his feet with quiet deliberation, adjusting his coat as he made his way toward the front. Calvin braced himself for a word of thanks, a hushed acknowledgement, but the man simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, heavy coin, and placed it on the fare box without a word. Calvin didn't need to pick it up to know what it was. He had seen one just like it before, years ago, tucked away in his father's things. A challenge coin. A token of respect, a silent recognition from one man to another. His fingers hovered over it for a moment before he finally took it, the cool weight settling into his palm. When he looked up, the man was already stepping off the bus, walking out into the rain, his posture as straight as it had been when he first boarded. Calvin turned the coin over in his hand, tracing the engraved emblem with his thumb. His jaw tightened. He knew what this meant. He knew what it really meant. And then, before he could process it further, his radio crackled to life. "Brooks, we need you in the office. Now." The voice was clipped. No room for discussion. Calvin exhaled slowly, sliding the coin into his pocket before switching off the ignition. He had seen this coming the moment those men had stepped off his bus. And he knew exactly what was waiting for him on the other side of that office door. Calvin walked into the transit office, the hum of flickering fluorescent lights overhead doing little to mask the tension in the air. The walls were lined with old service plaques and faded safety posters, reminders that this place prided itself on order, efficiency, and a rigid adherence to policy. It was the kind of place that didn't welcome disruption, and Calvin knew he had just caused one. Lawrence Tate, the transit supervisor, stood behind his desk, arms crossed, his jaw set in a tight line. He was the kind of man who lived by the book, who saw rules not as guidelines but as gospel. He had worked his way up from the bottom and had no patience for anything that risked upsetting the system he had spent years maintaining. His gaze flicked up as Calvin entered, unreadable, assessing. "Close the door," Tate said, voice clipped. Calvin did as he was told, stepping forward but keeping his stance relaxed, unreadable. He wasn't about to play defense. Tate let the silence hang between them for a moment before he finally spoke. "Tell me exactly what happened on your route today." Calvin met his gaze evenly. "3 men harassed a veteran on my bus. They mocked him, tried to humiliate him in front of everyone. I told them to apologize or leave." Tate's expression didn't change. "And they left?" Calvin nodded. "They didn't have a choice." Tate exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he dropped into his chair. He pinched the bridge of his nose, like he was dealing with a stubborn child. "You put me in a tough spot, Brooks." Calvin stayed silent, waiting. Tate leaned forward, hands clasped on the desk. "We have policies, Calvin. We don't get involved in personal disputes. We don't remove paying passengers unless there's a direct safety concern. What you did today, that wasn't protocol." Calvin's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. Letting a veteran get humiliated like that wasn't right. Tate sighed, shaking his head. "That's not the point. The point is, one of those men you kicked off, he's already filed a complaint. Says you created a hostile environment. Says he felt threatened." Calvin scoffed. "Threatened?" Tate's eyes darkened. "I'm not saying I agree, but it doesn't matter if I do. Corporate doesn't like bad publicity. They don't like complaints from people who have influence. And those guys? They've got influence." Calvin felt a slow, burning frustration coil in his gut. He had seen this before. People like Tate, people who claimed their hands were tied, who would rather look the other way than stand for something. Tate sighed again, this time heavier. "Look, I know you meant well, but you forced my hand here. We can't have drivers deciding who stays and who goes. That's not your call to make." Calvin stared at him. "So I should have just let them keep going. Let them tear down a man who's done more for this country than any of them ever will." Tate's gaze flickered for half a second, something almost like doubt flashing behind his eyes, but then it was gone, replaced by that same impassive, bureaucratic mask. "You're a good driver, Brooks, one of the best we have. But rules are rules. You're suspended, effective immediately." The words landed like a hammer. Calvin knew this was coming. He had felt it the moment he spoke up, the moment he made his choice. But hearing it out loud, having it confirmed, still sent a slow pulse of anger through him. He took a breath. For how long? Tate hesitated, and Calvin saw it then, the truth. This wasn't a suspension. This was an execution. "It's not temporary, is it?" Tate didn't answer right away, but he didn't have to. Calvin exhaled, slow and steady, then reached for his name badge. He unclipped it from his shirt, set it down on Tate's desk with a quiet finality. "If standing up for the right thing costs me this job," he said, his voice calm, even, unshaken, "then so be it." Tate didn't respond, didn't meet his eyes. Calvin turned, stepping toward the door. The air felt heavier as he walked out, the weight of what had just happened pressing into his spine. He had lost his job for doing what was right. And yet he felt no regret. What he didn't know was that, even as he walked out of that office, his story was already spreading. That by nightfall, the whole city would know his name. Calvin stepped out into the cold, the weight of his termination sinking in with each step. The city had darkened under the heavy clouds, the rain steady now, soaking through the thin fabric of his jacket as he walked toward his car. He should have felt angry, bitter, maybe even afraid. He had bills to pay, a life to maintain. And yet, as he pulled open the driver's side door and slid into the worn seat, he felt nothing but an odd, hollow sort of calm. He had done the right thing. That should have been enough. But as he sat there, fingers gripping the steering wheel, something gnawed at the back of his mind. Would it be enough? Would anything change? Or would this moment, this stand he had taken, fade away like so many others before it? His phone buzzed against the dashboard. He ignored it at first, but then it vibrated again. And again. Frowning, he picked it up. Missed calls 5. Messages 23. His stomach tightened. He tapped the screen. Bro, you're all over the news. Cal, check your phone. And wow. Man, you need to see this. They got you on video, dude. And it's everywhere. His heartbeat kicked up, a slow pulse of uncertainty rising in his chest. He opened the next message, a link. Without thinking, he clicked it. The video started playing immediately. Grainy at first, but clear enough. His bus, the suited men, the confrontation. The moment he turned to them, his voice steady as steel, either apologize to this man, or get off my bus. Calvin watched himself through someone else's eyes, watched the way he had held his ground. How the tension had thickened before the men finally backed down, stepping into the pouring rain. The camera lingered on the old veteran, the way he picked up his hat, the quiet nod he had given Calvin. Then the screen cut to headlines. Bus driver fired for defending veteran, public outrage grows. Calvin's pulse thrummed in his ears. The news anchors were talking fast, their voices blending together. Words flashed across the bottom of the screen. Viral video sparks national conversation on respect for veterans. His breath came slow, measured. This wasn't just a local story. It had gone beyond Jacksonville, beyond him. His phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. Another call. This time, an unknown number. He hesitated, then swiped to answer. Mr. Brooks. The voice on the other end was deep, steady, controlled. Calvin sat up straighter. Who's asking? A pause. Then General Henry Dawson. Silence. Calvin's grip tightened around the phone. The general's voice remained calm, but there was something underneath it, something firm. We need to talk. Calvin exhaled, his mind racing, heart pounding with a strange mix of anticipation and uncertainty. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Calvin gripped the phone tighter, his breath steady, though something deep inside him coiled with anticipation. General Henry Dawson. A name he had only ever heard in passing, spoken with reverence by the old-timers who still gathered at the corner cafe, muttered with quiet admiration by young Marines trying to live up to legends. The man was more than a veteran. He was a symbol. For a moment, Calvin didn't speak. Didn't know what to say. Then, Dawson broke the silence. Meet me at the Veterans Center. 20 minutes. The line clicked dead before Calvin could respond. Calvin exhaled, staring at the phone. There was no hesitation in that voice. No room for negotiation. He started the engine. The Jacksonville Veterans Center was a squat, nondescript building on the quieter side of town, tucked between a shuttered mechanic shop and a diner that had seen better days. Calvin pulled into the lot, shutting off the engine but not moving right away. The rain had eased to a mist, a soft drizzle clinging to the windshield. He could see a few men standing near the entrance, most of them older, their posture still holding remnants of discipline despite the years that had worn them down. And then there was him. General Dawson stood near the door, arms crossed, his sharp eyes scanning the parking lot as if assessing a battlefield. Even in his late 60s, he carried himself with the weight of someone who had commanded thousands, a presence that demanded attention without asking for it. His posture was straight, his face unreadable, save for the slight downturn of his mouth, a permanent line etched by time and experience. Calvin stepped out of the car, the damp air settling against his skin as he approached. Dawson's gaze locked onto him. Brooks. General. Dawson studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the building. Come inside. Calvin followed him through the doors, the scent of old books and stale coffee filling the air. The center was quiet, the kind of place built for men who had spent years in chaos and now just wanted peace. Dawson led him down a narrow hallway into a small office. There was nothing fancy about it. A wooden desk, a filing cabinet, a faded American flag mounted on the wall. Dawson gestured to a chair across from his desk, then sat down, his hands folded in front of him. You know why you're here, Dawson said. Calvin leaned back slightly. I've got an idea. Dawson let out a quiet chuckle. You remind me of your father. Calvin stiffened, caught off guard. You knew my father? Dawson nodded. Met him a few times. He was a good man. A damn good Marine. A fighter. His gaze sharpened. Like you. Calvin didn't answer. Dawson tapped his fingers against the desk. I saw the video. Calvin sighed. Yeah, so has half the country apparently. Dawson didn't react to the sarcasm. What you did back there, it matters. More than you realize. Calvin exhaled through his nose. All I did was kick some entitled pricks off my bus. And I lost my job for it. Dawson leaned forward. No, Brooks. You did something most people are too afraid to do. You stood up when it would have been easier to look away. You didn't hesitate. That's why this matters. Calvin shook his head. It won't change anything. Those kinds of guys, they'll walk into their offices tomorrow like nothing happened. Meanwhile, I've got no job, no paycheck, and a reputation that'll probably keep me from driving a bus again. Dawson tilted his head slightly, watching him. You really think that's how this ends? Calvin frowned. Isn't it? Dawson let a beat of silence pass before reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a folded sheet of paper, sliding it across the desk. Calvin hesitated before picking it up. He scanned the page. Then stopped. His pulse ticked up as he read the header. City of Jacksonville, Office of Veterans Affairs. He looked up sharply. What is this? A job offer. Dawson's expression was steady. The city has an opening. Senior advisor position. Someone to oversee veteran outreach, transportation policies, welfare services. Someone to make sure guys like me don't get left behind. Calvin let out a short, disbelieving breath. You think I'm qualified for this? Dawson smiled. You're the only one qualified for this. Calvin stared at the paper. He had spent years behind the wheel, taking people where they needed to go, never questioning where he was headed. And now suddenly there was a different road in front of him. Dawson leaned forward, his voice quieter now but firm. You stood up for one veteran that day. But this is how you stand up for all of them. Calvin swallowed hard. For the first time since stepping off that bus, he wasn't sure what came next. And for the first time in his life, he had a choice. Calvin stared at the job offer in his hands, the weight of it pressing into his fingertips. It felt heavier than paper should, like something more than an opportunity. A crossroads. A shift in direction he had never seen coming. For years, his life had been routine, predictable. Drive the bus, keep his head down. Do the job, do it well, and go home. But now, a different path had unfolded before him, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know which way to go. Dawson watched him carefully, reading the hesitation in his posture. You don't have to answer right now, he said, voice steady but firm. But you should know this isn't just about you anymore. Calvin looked up, frowning. Dawson leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze unwavering. Jacksonville Transit is in full damage control mode. The CEO called a press conference this morning. They're scrambling. They want to make this go away. He folded his hands on the desk. They're offering you your job back. Calvin scoffed before he could stop himself. Figures. Dawson smirked slightly. That's not all. They're also implementing new policies. Protections for transit workers who step in during harassment cases. Training programs to handle public altercations with dignity. All because of what you did. Calvin's fingers curled around the paper in his hand. He had spent his whole life believing that standing up for the right thing usually came with a cost. And it had. But for the first time he saw that it had also created change. Real, tangible change. Dawson's voice cut through his thoughts. They'll try to make you the face of their reform. They'll want you back on that bus, smiling for the cameras, proof that they did the right thing. He leaned in, his voice lower now, deliberate. But I need you to ask yourself, is that enough? Calvin exhaled slowly. A week ago he might have said yes. Might have gone back, taken the job, kept his head down. But now, sitting in front of a man who had spent his life fighting battles most people never even knew about, he realized something he didn't want to go back. His eyes dropped back to the offer letter. The words blurred slightly, but their meaning was crystal clear. You stood up for one veteran that day, but this This is how you stand up for all of them. He set the paper down and met Dawson's gaze. Tell me what I need to do. Dawson smiled, slow and knowing, as if he had been waiting for that moment. He pushed another document forward. First, we go to the city council. They need to hear from you. Then, we meet with the Veteran Outreach Board. After that, you get to work. Calvin picked up the pen. And just like that, his life changed. A week later, Calvin stood at a podium in front of a packed council chamber, cameras flashing, voices murmuring, the air thick with anticipation. He wasn't used to this. The attention, the expectation. But as he glanced out at the crowd, he saw them veterans, bus drivers, ordinary people who had seen what happened and cared. He took a breath and spoke. I didn't do what I did that day because I wanted attention. I did it because it was right. Because no one deserves to be treated like they don't matter, especially not the people who gave everything for this country. He let the words settle, then continued. I lost my job for it. But if that's what it took to make a change, then I'd do it again. Applause rippled through the room. He wasn't a bus driver anymore. He was something more. And he wasn't looking back. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.